It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We sneak through yet another film in the later era of the Universal Classic Horror series with this week's movie. I'm going to talk a little bit about 1946's The Cat Creeps. We've talked about this previously, but by this time, the mid-40s, the popularity of horror films were waning big time in the eyes of the public. And I suspect a lot of this had to do with the end of World War II and soldiers returning home from real-life horrors. And I'm going to come back around to that point here in just a few minutes. However, on top of that, the landscape of horror had shifted considerably. Up to this point, Universal was the king of horror for pretty much a couple of decades. The height of their popularity with audiences came in the 30s run of films starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. However, by the mid-30s, new leadership at Universal nearly put a stop to all horror whatsoever. It was only the popularity of theaters bringing back the early films, Frankenstein in particular, that made the head honchos at Universal change their mind to come back to making monster films. Lon Chaney Jr.'s arrival in the early 40s as the Wolfman and agreeing to play more monsters, including Dracula, the Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy, gave the genre and that wing of Universal a big shot in the arm for a couple of years. And it's really at this point that the Universal Classic Monster cycle was born. If Frankenstein got a sequel, then Wolfman would get one, then The Invisible Man, and then The Mummy. The order might have been different, but you kind of get the idea. It was a cycle. With every movie that got a sequel, then you can count on the others getting a sequel. The only one that really didn't was Dracula. But the monsters were becoming a little passé by the end of the war. Karloff and Lugosi had moved on to other studios and films with mixed results, and even major supporting and contributing actors like Lionel Atwill, George Zucco, and John Carradine had moved on as well. And there were also, diminishing returns. And with those bankable stars no longer with the studio, Universal was shifting to something a little bit modern and of that time. And as I mentioned, I believe some of the end of the war and post-war sensibilities since then kind of played a factor here. The people who were most likely the primary audience for monster movies in 1941 when The Wolfman came out were kids and teenagers. It wouldn't be long before they were going off to fight the Axis powers. So by the end of the war, their return to stateside, they likely had outgrown the genre and the style of horror films that Universal was making. Besides, what they saw overseas was likely far, far, far worse than anything a movie would show them, especially with a gothic creature like a Dracula or a Frankenstein. So taste had shifted, and thrillers and more modern ideas involving science and crime was much more interesting to audiences. So enter The Cat Creeps. Now, some call this a bit of a reworking of an earlier Universal horror thriller called Horror Island. But Universal called on Earl C. Kenton, who had directed The Ghost of Frankenstein, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula, to direct this movie as well. His best horror film probably was Island of Lost Souls in 1932, which he made for Paramount, but in the 90s it became part of the Universal Classic Monster series of VHS releases. Now, starring in this film, or at least the most recognizable name for most people in this film, is Noah Beery Jr. Now, Beery racked up almost 200 credits in film and TV in his 60-plus year career. But I know him best as Rocky, Jim Rockford's father on The Rockford Files, and that was the role that got him 3 Primetime Emmy nominations. Now, The Cat Creeps is not the typical Universal horror. As I said, the monster genre was all but dead, at least from the gothic horror monster movie standpoint. What was popular were thrillers and whodunits. So while Universal was promoting it like their usual monster stuff, it's really more of a thriller And what was called by the authors of Universal Horrors, which was a book that kind of dove into the history of the Universal monster and horror films of that era, they called it a horror whodunit. Now, I wonder if that kind of hurt the movie upon release. It wasn't overly received well. Some thought it was at least serviceable, but most thought it as something a little bit more forgettable than anything else. And what's interesting is that appraisal did not really change as years went by. Later reviews considered it not well distinguished or memorable either. I mean, however, many more recent reviews point out the film's superb sporting cast. Now, I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. But the funniest review of them all came from a teenaged Joe Dante. Now, Dante was born to become the director that he would become in the 70s, 80s, and beyond, because as a teen, he was writing for Famous Monsters of Filmland. And in 1962, when he was only like 15, 16, 17, somewhere around there, he named The Cat Creeps as one of the worst horror films he had ever seen. And the way that he kind of wrote about it seems much, much more mature than what a 16-year-old would say typically about movies. But I guess that's why Vinegar Syndrome surprisingly stepped up to the plate to clean up the movie and give it a nice Blu-ray release last year. If you have something that's obscure, if you have something that didn't quite get that great of reception upon release, if it's possibly one of Joe Dante's least favorite horror films, then Vinegar Syndrome has the manpower and the gumption to clean that movie up with a brand new high-class Blu-ray release. But the movie opens at a newspaper where an editor is kind of reading a note from a woman named Cora, who claims that she's discovered the evidence of a murder in the death of a man who had originally been ruled as a suicide some 15 years earlier. She claims that she had found a large fortune, and to prove it, she sent a $1,000 bill to the paper. She says that she found the evidence and the fortune thanks to her black cat, a cat that creeps. Now, see, this Eric fella, his death was investigated for possible murder, and one of the suspects was a relative of Cora's who's now running for the U.S. Senate. The editor, a guy named Sampler, sends Terry Nichols to investigate and deliver a surprise discovery of the senator's involvement in this guy's death so that Sampler's brother-in-law can defeat him in the upcoming election. That senator's name is Walter Elliott. Now, Terry isn't exactly keen to take the job to help Sampler because he's dating Walter Elliott's daughter, Gay. Now, news of Terry's involvement in the story and his orders to find dirt on the senator doesn't do much to really rankle Walter, but it does certainly upset Gay. Walter's kind of used to people coming after him, but Gay's a little upset because it's her boyfriend who's being asked to do this. Now, Terry and his photographer, Pidge, who Noah Beery plays, follow Walter and Gay as they meet with his lawyer, Tom, and Tom's assistant, Connie, as well as another associate, Ken, a private investigator previously hired by Tom and Walter at one point. And they've kind of gone to watch them, and they've decided to take a boat out to Cora's mansion in what appears to be like a bog or a swamp. And they plan to kind of put an end to all of this and clear Walter's name once and for all. So Tom and Pidge decide to tag along. Now we meet Cora Williams, who is a recluse and indeed owns a black cat. The various characters who have come to Cora's decide that despite the doors being locked and there not being any lights on, maybe they should try to get inside anyway. Besides, there's some sort of business with $200,000 that Cora supposedly found with the thanks of her black cat. Now, Terry, Pidge, and Gay are the first ones to seemingly gain entry in through the front door of the house. And in her bedroom, Cora is confronted by someone and screams. Now, by the time Terry, Pidge, and Gay run upstairs and find the old lady unconscious, there's no sign of who that person was or that anybody else had been up there. The person who entered that bedroom, as we could see in the shadows, was wearing a hat. Now, Walter, Ken, and Tom are all wearing hats. So is Pidge, but we were with Pidge, Terry, and Gay downstairs when the scream happened. Everyone begins kind of questioning where everyone else was at the time that they heard that scream. And as they try to suss out who was where when the scream was heard, Gay informs them that the boat that they arrived on is currently on fire out there at the dock. So that means everybody is kind of stuck there for the night at least. Now, as Connie watches over Cora, Ken comes in and he asks if Cora's died yet. And they kind of talk over some stuff suspiciously, almost seeming like they're in cahoots together. But they hear Cora begin to speak in her sleep. And she says there is $200,000 in the little house. Now, while they listen to her, the man with the hat in his silhouette also listens in. Pidge, gathering wood for the fireplace, is soon attacked by an unknown assailant by being kicked in the face. And the next time we see Connie with Cora, the man with the hat comes back, which causes Connie to pass out. And it makes Cora scream once again. But this time, Cora has died. And suddenly we are introduced to Kyra. Now, she says that she goes where she is called. And Cora called to her. And Kyra says that Cora's cat now possesses the old lady's spirit. And she explains that Kyra, is Eric Goran's daughter. Now, Eric Goran was the guy who was killed 15 years previously. Pidge is trying to figure out who attacked him earlier, but Gay has found Ken's business card with Cora's word about the hidden money in the small house, but when she tries to compare it to Connie's handwriting, she's knocked out and taken by the shadowy figure. When Connie is about to confess to Kyra about what she knows and who she saw, Connie herself is killed. And Kyra says that in time, the cat will reveal who the killer is. But until then, death will continue to stalk the mansion. Kyra and Terry work together to make it seem like, one, Terry and Pidge are leaving the island, and two, having her put the cat down so that Terry can leave the $1,000 bill he got from his boss over by where the cat is sitting on the floor, so that Kyra can claim that the cat has found this money and can lead them to the fortune, and of course also to the killer. Terry tells Pidge that they're not leaving, and what they will get is a more honest performance from the others if they think the newspaper guys are gone. And while Gay looks for a dollhouse that Cora once gave her when she was a kid, someone watches from under the cellar stairs where Gay has gone to find this dollhouse. But then Ken comes in and starts to menacingly approach her, but the person under the stairs pulls his hand through and trips him, and he falls onto a pitchfork and kills him. Eventually, as pressure mounts and everyone becomes more and more suspicious of each other, Terry discovers Tom trying to follow the cat to the dollhouse where he expects to find the money. Tom, as it turns out, used to represent some bootleggers that the dead Eric Goran led. And he tried to kill Eric to take the money that was earned from that was being stashed at Cora's. And he knew where it was, or he knew that it was hidden somewhere on Cora's property, because that's where the bootlegging business would go to basically unload and load up and use the rivers and the swamp area to kind of pass around the booze. Now, Kyra is not actually Eric's daughter. She was just an actress that Terry hired to help bring out the killer. Tom killed the others to continue to frame, the other people around for murder. But the cat was indeed trying to get to that dollhouse where Tom followed it, thinking that's where the money is, because that's where her kittens were. Terry even used that fact to lure Tom, because he knew more than what was being led on to begin with. So it turns out that Tom, the lawyer, turned out to be untrustworthy, and I don't know, maybe that's an 80s joke waiting to happen 40 years too soon about untrustworthy lawyers and whatnot. But let's get to the three things that I like about The Cat Creeps. First up, as I mentioned earlier, the movie should get the attention it does for the supporting cast. Terry, who really kind of is our lead character, is played by Fred Brady, but Brady didn't have that many credits as an actor. He was actually a little bit better known for writing TV shows, including 12 scripts for 77 Sunset Strip in the late 50s and early 60s. And in fact, he died kind of young at the age of 49 before his final episode of 77 Sunset Strip aired. He's okay as Terry, but the rest of the cast is much more interesting. Noah Beery is great as Pidge, a kind of comedic character who definitely has more of a sardonic and sarcastic view of the world and the situation. Iris Clive plays Kyra, and she's mysterious and lays on a thick accent that I believe is meant to be Creole. Her dark features and her ominous tone and line delivery kind of makes for an interesting addition when she mysteriously appears in the midway point of the movie. And then we have Paul Kelly, who plays the threatening Ken Grady. And he's always where you don't want him to be, and he is a pretty great red herring because he is so threatening and seemingly is the least likable person in this entire movie. He's that type of private investigator who walks a little bit too much on the darker side, and it makes him much less trustworthy. These were good performances, and it's very clear why Beery would be the most successful of the bunch of actors in this movie, too. He's got the most life to him. He's got the most range to some of his scenes as well. So that's pretty good. Now, second, there is a nice mood and attitude to this movie. No one in this movie seems all that quote-unquote good. It's possible that Walter Elliott is guilty of killing someone, and he's supposedly a U.S. senator or will be a U.S. senator soon. Tom quickly proves himself to be somewhat of an untrustworthy lawyer. And I've already said that Ken is menacing, and Kyra is meant to be something of a witch. I think that's how she was supposed to originally be presented in the story. But the scriptwriters were advised heavily to not use the word witch in the script because when it was being spoken, it could be too easily confused with the word bitch, a word that was not allowed to pass the codes back at that time. So it would have been censored and would have been really difficult to use. Now, Connie is clearly working with Ken to try to get this money. It's just a group of characters that you aren't too sure if you're supposed to even like. And besides, our primary lead, Terry, is prioritizing a job that he was hired to do and kind of handed to dig up dirt on his own girlfriend's father. And he kind of plays this off as if he seemingly has no objections of doing it once he actually is on the job. And in fact, if you really kind of think about it, his boss, Sampler, is using a newspaper to smear a senator so that his brother-in-law has a better chance of winning an election, which in and of itself has got a lot of ethical problems there. But the people in this movie are seemingly kind of poisoned, at least in Terry's case, by his job. And in everyone else's case, the mysterious $200,000 in cash. So it does provide an attitude to this movie that I kind of like. And lastly, while The Cat Creeps is absolutely not really a horror movie and definitely not a monster movie, that doesn't mean it doesn't do its damnedest to make it creepy. This is mostly thanks to two things that make for a good horror or thriller. The first is the use of a location that is very much secluded. Like I said, it's like a big old house out in a marsh or a swamp. And they say it's actually on an island, which means they have absolutely no way out when the boat has been set on fire. So secluding the characters in this remote location is great. And the second is where things get a lot more horror-like in execution here. The movie uses shadows quite well. Whenever we see that killer watching and stalking, they're only ever shown as a silhouette projected as a shadow against the wall. Even the cat is shown in shadow, kind of creeping about. It helps with that mood and attitude that I just talked about in my previous like for this movie. And it does make the movie feel more like a horror movie, even though it's more closely related to noir thrillers more than anything else. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Now, don't forget to follow Film Seizure at the various social media spots that we're found in, like Facebook, Threads, Instagram, Blue Sky. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesday mornings and Monster Mondays on Mondays afternoons at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. And you can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we have another old chiller from the 40s as I discuss RKO's 1943 film, I Walked with a Zombie. Until next week, stay spooky.